That is too. I mean, if you're in a heated pool and it's the absolute perfect temperature, you're just going to jump straight in that.
That's right. That's right. So, we're also, when we're talking about a temperation, what we're talking about is in essence we're helping our little yeast guys slide in from the top of the pool deck into the must, right? But we're talking more than just temperatures, because we're talking also about the pH level. They just came from, I don't know if it's a neutral pH, to be honest with you, but I know that the pH that they were just born in, so to speak, is way different than the pH that our must is, right? And so we've got the pH, which is generally very acidic. We've got a tremendous amount of gravity. I don't know how many of you guys are scuba divers, but if you ever take a tennis ball down just at 100 feet or 120 feet scuba diving, that tennis ball is absolutely crushed flat. I mean, flat as a pancake. So and if you've never gone scuba diving, you know what it's like to swim in the shallow part of the pool and then go over to the deep end and go diving for pennies at the bottom of the deep end. Just that 12 or 15 feet difference, there's a lot more pressure on your body. Well, that's the same as a high gravity. You've got all this pressure from all the solids in the water weighing in against the cell membrane, and it's crushing it. And that, incidentally, that's also why if you get to too high of a gravity, the yeast can't even get started, because we've crushed their cell membrane so tightly that nothing now can move in and out of the cell membrane. And that's why at some point, and I think different yeast might be able to tolerate higher gravity starts than others. And you've also got the same osmosis issue there. You've got this really high sugary solution on one side, and the yeast is a very low sugary solution. So you're going to actually, if you dump them into a really high sugary solution at the wrong time, it's going to try and inject sugar inside the yeast cell wall, which is going to upset.
Or it'll pull all the water out of the cell.
Well, yeah, a bit of both.
Depending on how permeable the membrane is.
Yeah. And that's what that's also another big issue with that. So it's not just all this pressure that's sort of they're trying to stand up, they're barely able to stand kind of thing. It's also the fact that someone's bleeding them dry at the same time.
Yes, that's correct. So here's what we do to make the transition from one living environment to the next. So imagine now you've got your Corningware dish, and I'd like to call this the slurry now. It's our yeast slurry. And then, of course, what we want to do is we want to get our yeast slurry eventually into our vessel, whatever that is, a bucket, a conical, a carboy. Everybody uses different gear, but eventually we want to take our yeast slurry that's sitting in the Go Firm, and in the nice warm bath, we need to get it into our must so that it can start to do its thing. So we want to do that very slowly. So now imagine I've got my little Corningware dish with my yeast slurry in there. What I like to encourage people to do is to take no more than a quarter of the amount. Let's just say for grains, we've got a full cup of yeast slurry in there. And you all know that it's much bigger than that. But for demonstration purposes, let's say we have a cup of yeast slurry in our Go Firm bucket that we just started. Before this 30-minute thing ends up being passed, in other words, at about 20 or 25 minutes, I start to slowly take a little bit of the must out of my fermenter and add it to my yeast slurry. And I don't like, at least initially, I don't like to add any more than about a quarter of the amount. So if I've got a cup of yeast slurry, I want to take a quarter cup of my must and politely sprinkle it into my little container with my yeast slurry in there. Now what have I done? My yeast slurry was warm and my must was cooler, and so I've just added a little bit of the cool must to the warm yeast slurry, so now we're starting to lower the temperature. We've also added a little bit of gravity, just a little bit, so it's not a huge shock for the yeast. We've started to change the acidity that they're now living in. And every 5 or 10 minutes, add a little bit more, little bit more, little bit more. And then if we do this very slowly over time, and I kind of think the slower you do it, maybe the better. I don't know exactly what time frame these guys are on. But if I've got the time, I'll sometimes take a couple hours to get, and I generally pitch, and I like to make stuff in 10-gallon batches, and so I've got a pretty big dish of my slurry. Now the instructions tell us as long as we get within 18 degrees of our slurry temperature to the must, that we now are okay to go ahead and pitch our slurry into our must. It doesn't take that much longer to get it to within the exact same temperature, and so that's actually what I do. And so that's what I do. I slowly add the must to the slurry until eventually the slurry now is the same temperature. I doubt it's the same gravity, but it's a lot closer. And over time they've gotten used to the temperature change, the gravity change, the pH adjustment, and so forth. And so that eventually at one point when we finally do decide to put our yeast into the must, we've brought them to a place that they can now jump into the pool without shooting up to the top and screaming and all of that.
So I don't know. This was just a bit of gut feel with me. There's no real experimentation or science behind it. But what I'll typically do there is I like to double the volume. So if I've got 200 mil of slurry, then I'll add to it 200 mil of must, and then I'll let it acclimatise for a while, and then I'll add 400 mil of must to that until it's up to about 3 or 4 times normally, until it's up to a size that I'm happy with, or the jug is full. It's mostly most commonly, and then I'll pitch it at that point.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's typically how I'd make a starter. Since I don't tend to use a rehydrating aid, I'm only using the suggested quarter cup of water for rehydrating a package. And usually by the time the 15 minutes it says on the package that you're supposed to wait has elapsed, it's gotten down to room temperature, which is what my must will be at that point. So typically I just sort of introduce a little bit of the must into the measuring cup that I rehydrate the yeast in, and then once they've been introduced, then I start adding it in.
Right. Now, for some clarification, that's a little bit different than making a real starter, because a real starter's on a stir plate, and the magic of what that's doing is it's actually adding the oxygen to the little guys, as they so much need in the early phase of this whole process as well. I think that's fine to do it that way, but in my opinion, if you think that making a starter, and I'm not talking specifically to you, AJ, I'm now talking to our audience. Some people think that, I don't need to pitch the proper amount of yeast because I can put it in the starter and they'll start multiplying. If you weren't here last week, then I would invite you to go back and listen to the show last week, because that'll tell you the difference between pitching at the proper pitch rates versus starting with less, and why making a starter and counting on the multiplication process of already taking place before you pitch, that's better than nothing, but it's really not the same as pitching the actual designed amounts to get started with up front. So that's a perfect segue now into our next section, which we want to talk about aeration. And a lot of people, this again, you don't have to do this.
It's very underrated.
It's very underrated. A lot of people think that what they do are fine. And what I'm about to teach you all comes out of Chris White's book called Yeast, blah, 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 blah. I can't remember the rest of it, but...
Nice.
Get it at your local bookstore.
That's right.
I'm sure Amazon will bring that right up when I go
blah,
looking for it.
And so...
he's got that book, The Complete Blah, 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 as I recall. It's a great one. You should get it.
It's a great book. You should get it, yeah.
That's right.
All right, back on the rails.
Yeah, so what I want to show you is best case scenario, okay? I'm not saying you have to do what the book tells us you have to do, but I will say this: if you want to do what the book tells us is the best case for our yeast, you can't get it done with the oxygen that we breathe in our atmosphere. It's impossible. So it's very important that we give as much oxygen to our yeast, especially in this very, very early portion of their life, because what they're going to do, and this kind of will also overlap with the lag phase, which we will talk about in a little bit. But the aeration is very important because oxygen is a nutrient that the yeast need to do some lipid synthesis and to create sterols. Now, exactly what that is, I won't tell you that I really know for sure, but I know that they have to have both lipids and sterols to create the proper cell wall that will make them strong and healthy and ferment all the way to the end of the fermentation process.
The oxygen is also integral for division, I believe. So that's why we use it at the start.
Yep, that's actually very true. The more oxygen we have and the higher temperatures that we have, the faster growth rate we will have with our yeast. But where we really will see the biggest difference with aeration, well, maybe I won't say the biggest, but for sure what's vitally important is that by setting our yeast up again at this very early stage, we're setting them up to have success 2 and 3 weeks later down the road. And so the oxygen actually will give the yeast the building blocks that they need to build a strong cell wall so that they can resist the effects of the ethanol in our must, in our mead, 3 weeks down the road. Too little of oxygen causes a very long fermentation. It prolongs things. They've actually done some studies, and proper O2 additions will actually make your batch finish faster, 33% faster than if you do not have the proper oxygen additions. Now, they talk about in the book the average beer, and we're not making beer, granted, but it's the same yeast, and they go through the same process. They talk about, and as you guys know, a big beer is like 1070, right? That's almost a hydromel to us, isn't it?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So a big beer, or a beer with a gravity of 1070, they require 8 to 10 parts per million of oxygen. That's their best case scenario. They really need 8 or 10 parts per million to have the amount of oxygen they need to work efficiently, proficiently, and as our gravities go higher and higher, they need even more oxygen. We will also, if we under-oxygenate, we're going to end up having a much smaller biomass. They're going to have lower viability, and that will also then create more mutations in the earlier generations than if they have the proper amount of oxygen. Now, here's where people go wrong in their thinking. They think that by splashing, and we know that, right? We some of us use leaf stirrers on the end of our drills, and we whip the crap out of that, and we create this huge vortex, and we do that for 10 minutes. We do that for 20 minutes, we do that for 40 minutes, we do that for 10 hours, but the fact of the matter is the maximum that you can get with the oxygen here on Earth is 8 parts per million. When you splash by hand, you grab this big old 6-gallon carboy and you shake it like crazy. And these are results that the guys from Scott's Laboratories did with a machine that they can measure dissolved oxygen in the must. Okay, so this isn't me just making up some crap. This is what the guys with the machines that cost $1,000 that they can measure the results of these different things that people do to try to oxygenate